see the world through other people's eyes. Empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Unites people. Armies, gold, flags, stories. There's nothing in the world more powerful than a good story. Nothing can stop it.
If you want to stand out from everybody else, you need to get into storytelling.
Draw a different frame around the same set of circumstances and new pathways come into view.
Welcome to ARTEFACTLive with me, Scott MacArthur, where we look at the art and science of story. We don't care who you are, whether you're a bricklayer, a professor or a speaker, all we care about is you being a good storyteller.
Thank God the drama's arrived.
It's time to realise that facts tell, but it's stories that sell.
Get me some nasty and get it now or someone's getting shot.
And that's a niche of a niche of a niche of a niche of a niche. 1,000 comments.
Selling a hemorrhoid cream to someone who's got hemorrhoids.
Got a whip.
I was born into a deep contradiction.
This stuff's magic.
Oh, that's so clever.
Well, rather than admitting my error, I'm trying to pretend I didn't make a mistake.
The power of live TV.
Oh gosh, oh dear. Anyway, sorry, John. If you're, I'll edit that out when I rebroadcast it because that's too embarrassing. Oh dear. You think after 74 episodes, you think I'd know what I was doing?
That's the joy of it all, isn't it?
Oh, as actually, it sometimes makes the show, doesn't it, when things go slightly wrong? Because
I think so.
You just you don't know what's going to happen. And the other thing is, I've lost my glasses, so I can't see.
So anything could happen basically, and you're in control. You've got the flight controls. I'm co-piloting.
Yeah, well, I can just about see the controls. So have you had a good week, my friend?
I have had a very, very good week. Thank you.
Excellent. Now, last week's show with Bree was lovely, wasn't it? I mean, what a show!
Just amazing. Just a very different pace, but lots to chew on and lots to reflect on. So
yes. She really. I mean, we need to get her on again so we can see her, because I'm not the only one that makes mistakes with technology.
I don't know what you mean.
And but the dialogue after the show with her and with some other people has been lovely. I don't know if you've seen any of it, but it's been really nice. And I think the bear story, that was gorgeous. That was.
Yeah.
And I know that's almost the most superficial part of the whole show, but I really loved it because it's a real story. You couldn't make it up.
No, you can't. And it's funny how those kind of stories, people sort of connect with it too.
Yes, no, absolutely. So Bree, if you're watching, thank you very much for last week. It was fantastic, and I think a show with her. I mean, there's probably about 10 different topics that we didn't even touch that you and her talked about. But we could take them into another show without a doubt with her.
Oh, easily. There's plenty there, and she's great company. So
absolutely, I could tell. So this week, well, I mean, I'm excited again, folks, because this is a conversation that Paul has had, and I wasn't there, and I actually have only watched the beginning and the end, so I don't know the content. Well, I kind of know the content because I know about this fella, but you'll know why when you get into the discussion. But I am really intrigued by this. So how did you get to meet Jon? How was the?
I can't remember. I think it was through Nottingham Business School. I was trying to find a way into that, and one of my friends, Keith, had sort of introduced me, and then I'd introduced me to Chris, who's now at University of Surrey.
Yes.
And I think through connections, because I was running around IBM trying to get in work with the music industry and the media and entertainment folks. And Jon's name came up. So we got in touch, and he was at Ashridge at the time. And again, I thought, well, if I could get involved at Ashridge, that'd be fun. So he was kind enough to meet me 2 or 3 times and try and open things up, but that didn't happen for various reasons. And we just stayed in touch. So learned a lot about him. Very, very smart, very gentle, creative soul, doing some wonderful work in the field of writing. So his relationship with Arvon, and obviously he's a published author himself. So
Yes.
so that's Written Ordinary Joe. So that side of him comes out in this interview as well. So I think just that creative background and wanting to help people grow and develop and give them opportunities makes him a fantastic guest for us to have.
Fantastic. I mean, the part you can probably guess. I'm looking forward to hear him. I don't know if he does it, but does he talk about his time at the BFI?
Yes, he does a little bit.
Right. Okay. Because we've had a couple of film producers on previously, and I found them extreme. Mariana Polka was on, who's the Scottish film director and actress, and she's been nominated for all sorts of things like Palme d'Ors. Okay. She was amazing, and it was there's an alchemy there that, you know, I like it. It's the same with writing, of course, but I think the film making side of things is really interesting and something that, you know, I think we could all learn from. So even if he doesn't go into it in depth, it's still interesting hearing the sort of guy that could get to that level in the BFI. Did he run the BFI? Was he in charge of it, or was he?
Yeah.
I thought he was. Yeah. So. Well, let's roll the VT then. Now, what we'll do, folks, I'll stop it a couple of times. I won't interrupt the flow. If there's a natural part where I think, we need to chat a little bit more about that, Paul and I will come back. We are here, though, so if you've got any questions, just let us know, or any observations, let us know, and we can come on and chat about those as we go through the show. This is an hour long, this one, so it's a really meaty one, which I love the fact we're doing proper dialogues, not 30-second snippets on TikTok.
Don't get me started.
I know. So here we go. Here's Jon. So is it Teckman? Is that how he pronounces it?
Yes, it is.
Jon Teckman, right? This is Jon Teckman, everybody. I hope you enjoy the conversation that Paul had with Jon.
Well, welcome to this episode of ARTEFACTLive, and I am thrilled to be able to introduce you to Mr. Jon Teckman, who I've known for quite some time. And just before we push the record button, we were reflecting on the fact we were trying to remember when was the last time we'd met, and it's amazing. It's 3 years ago. Hello, Jon. How are you?
I'm very well, Paul. Nice to see you again.
Yeah,
it must have been summer 2019, I think.
Summer 2019. Gosh, that seems a long time ago. I tell you what, it was cooler than summer 2022. That's for sure.
Yeah, very much. Yeah.
So, how are you?
Yeah, I'm very well. Trying to get by in this heat. I'm the sort of, I don't actually complain about it when it's too hot.
No.
I've done plenty of holidays and worked in plenty of hot countries.
Yes.
As I always say, the problem isn't the weather, it's how you as an individual or society react to the weather.
Yes.
And we're not particularly good at that in this country for good, understandable reasons. But I think we have to make the most of it while we've got this nice weather, because we'll be complaining enough again when it starts raining.
I was going to say, when it comes to November. Plus, you and I are old enough to remember 1976 as well.
Indeed.
Which was similar. And I was trying to think back. Someone on Twitter had said, "Does anyone remember 1976?" And I said, "Yeah, I was in hospital, so it was doubly uncomfortable." So I was covered in damp towels and wet sheets to try and keep me warm as I came back.
Was that
some minor surgery?
Was that related to the heat, or? No.
I was just having some minor surgery on a toe. Big stuff. But at the time, to a 13-year-old, it was a big deal.
My main memory of 1976 is, as you can see over this shoulder.
Yeah.
I'm a bit of a cricket fan, and 1976 was my first ever visit to Lord's cricket ground to see a domestic cup final between Northamptonshire and Lancashire. I'm from Northampton.
Right.
And
yes, I'm looking at the colours of the jersey behind you. Is that Northampton?
Yeah, I've got my Saints shirt over one shoulder, and an image of Jos Buttler running out Martin Guptill to win the World Cup, which was 3 years ago, almost to the day actually. I think it was last week, 3 years ago. So that's my main memory, and it just being incredibly hot, and the outfield being parched, and Northampton winning.
Well, Northants winning would make up for any discomfort, that's for sure. So what have you been up to since I last saw you? Because you're a man of many talents with many strings to your bow. Some of which I know you publicise and some of which you don't, or as much these days. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, and obviously the big thing that's happened since we last saw each other is COVID, and that had quite a big impact on most of the work that I was doing, because working on leadership training programs, mostly these days through the University of Surrey.
Okay.
And COVID put paid to quite a lot of that work and changed what survived from being face-to-face to being online.
Okay.
Which is never quite as good. I appreciate we're doing this online, and it's one-to-one online, I think, works quite well, or one to a small group. But when you're talking about one to a larger group, I don't know if you've had similar experience, but it's never quite as I never feel quite as comfortable trying to talk to a larger group.
I've done the one-to-many online. The one I find really difficult is the one-to-many where some are in the room and some are online.
Yeah.
I got thrown into a situation that was a real fight for survival at the time. It was kind of like, oh God, what do I do with these people over here? And then there's people in the room, and how do I get them? So in the end, I just threw everyone online, and that actually made it a lot easier, because I find one of the things we found was, so I've been doing martial arts since I last saw you, and of course through lockdown, everything closed down. But the dojo we're very, very creative in that they did online classes, so we do half an hour's warm-up and we work through techniques and all that kind of stuff. And when they came back, so it was sort of like starting to come back, you couldn't quite do full contact. They were using sticks, but they had two facilitators. There was one for the sort of in the playground, in the parking lot outside the dojo, which was where one of the classes was held, and then there was all the people online. So they had to split that up, and it was through that I learned how to do it. It's not easy, is it?
No, although I think virtual martial arts are probably the only martial arts I dare to take on. I've just recently gone back into doing fitness classes at my local gym, and the one I've done a couple of times in the last week is the body combat, which is, it's a bit like shadow boxing, where you're using boxing in particular, or some martial art type moves, but only in a fitness, you're not in a fighting way.
Right.
And I've reminded myself how incredibly uncoordinated I am, how when any move goes beyond sort of jab, uppercut, cross and involves moving your feet, I seem to like I'm doing dad dancing.
Well, if it's any comfort, I have the same thing when it, because we don't, our arm art isn't a striking art per se, but we do striking so that it's practical. If on the street anything happened, you could react rather than going, well, would you wait just a moment and get into the proper position so that I can do a technique on you. So that's good. So you're at Surrey. You were at University in London, the arts. Tell us a little about your journey to where you got now for people who haven't come across.
Well, yeah, it depends how far you want to go back with us. But straight from university, I joined the civil service.
Yeah.
As you know, because we follow each other on Twitter, I am pretty active politically, or I'm not active in the way of actually getting anything done, but just ranting about the political situation. And part of my current sort of perspective on that is from having been a civil servant in the mid to late 80s and then through the 90s. And for much of that time, I was working with governments I didn't necessarily, hadn't voted for and didn't necessarily agree with. Mm-hmm. But you also always had a relationship with ministers where it was based on presenting things factually, and the role of the civil servant was very much like it was in Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, where you're trying to ensure that ministers tell the truth, even if they tell it in a way that is designed to cover up any failings there might be in the policy or their delivery. Yes. And so I'm not entirely sure how comfortable I'd be working as a civil servant in the current environment, which is mainly a criticism of the current government. But actually, I think that you can date some of this back to the spin doctoring days of Mandelson and Campbell, when Tony Blair first came in. So I don't think it's entirely the current government. I think the current Prime Minister has kind of taken it to new levels, maybe. But so I started as a civil servant, and then I ended up working in what is now Ms. Dorries' Department Culture, Media and Sport. Mm-hmm. I worked on introducing the National Lottery in the early 90s, which was very interesting and quite an exciting project to be part of.
Yes.
And then worked on film policy, which led me to, after a couple of years, 2 or 3 years working on film policy, I got to meet a lot of people, a lot of key people in the industry.
Yes.
And I sort of headhunted then to go and join the British Film Institute as their deputy director. So BFI, based in London, it runs the National Film Theatre, the IMAX cinema now, although that wasn't there when I arrived. The National Film and Television Archive, which is out quite near where I live, up in Berkhamsted. And the education department, stuff like that. So I joined there, which was quite a significant promotion from having been a mid-ranking civil servant. I never quite achieved senior civil service ranking, to going to being the deputy director of a 500-person organisation and doing a lot of the management of the organisation, because the director, the guy above me, was far more the outward-facing leader, and I was sort of leading internal aspects of it. And then, just to compound that, or to multiply that still further, he then left after 18 months to go and form a new organisation called the UK Film Council. And I found myself in quite a difficult position of wanting to take over, not wanting someone else to come in and be the director when I was deputy director, but also having some doubts about whether I was really ready for it. I was probably about 35, 36 years old at the time, only been in this sort of management role, senior management role for 18 months. And whether it was vanity or whatever got the better of me. So I did go for the director role and got it.
Good.
And did that role just for 3 years. It was a 3-year contract, and I was offered to renew the contract. But for various reasons, the major one of which was during my first 3-year contract, my first son had been born, my second one was on the way. I decided I wasn't enjoying it very much. And here to talk about stories, a story for you is I got that realization when I was sitting on the beach in Cannes at the Cannes Film Festival and thinking, actually, I'd rather be at home. And when you get to that stage, when you've got a beer in your hand at Cannes and the weather, the weather's like it is today here, and everything is great, and you suddenly think, actually, I'd rather be at home. So I did what I've lived my life my career's been in reverse in some ways. And I started off with my very sort of in very structured, formal sort of roles, and I've got less and less structured as I've gone on. And I've gone from, I peaked when I was about 36, director of the BFI. I've gone sort of downwards since and managed fewer and fewer people and been quite happy to do that. So when I left the BFI, I didn't have anything immediately to go to. I did some consultancy work for about a year, still around the sort of film and media area. And then I used to buy the Sunday Times in those days, partly because they had a really good appointments section, recruitment section. And I just saw an advert in there one day from a place I'd never heard of called Ashridge Business School. And they were looking for leaders, for people to teach leadership, particularly to the public sector. And what caught my attention was they weren't asking for any particular teaching experience. They were looking for people who had experience of leading in the public sector. So I applied for that and got it, and spent the next dozen or so years in one way or another at Ashridge, working on various programs, much of which was incredibly enjoyable. I actually only was on the full-time staff there for 5 years and then left to become an associate, but was doing almost as much work, almost as many hours, whilst also having time to do other things as well. The main one of which was writing a novel. And I'd started writing a novel sometime before this, sometime before I joined Ashridge. And in 2007, so I joined Ashridge in 2004 or 5. And in 2007, for my 10th wedding anniversary, my wife bought me a place on a voucher to go on an ARVON writing course. And the ARVON Foundation is a charity that helps to promote creative writing. It runs courses that people who can afford to pay for, but then it also runs a lot of courses for people who can't afford them, and targets particular excluded groups. And I'm just to cut to the chase and jump to the end of this, I'm now on the board of ARVON. So having started my novel when I went there in 2007, I've now sort of come full circle, and I'm now helping to run the organisation. So I went off there, did a very enjoyable course, started writing a novel, kept refining it over the course and submitting it to various agents and getting various rejections over the next 8 years. Went on another writing course with Curtis Brown Creative, which is obviously run by Curtis Brown, the leading literary agent. And then in 2015, got it published, Ordinary Joe. This is not my artifact, but I thought I'd bring it along anyway to plug it. So that's my novel, Ordinary Joe, which was published by Borough Press, which is part of HarperCollins. And that was a time of great excitement. So just to fit this back into my career, I'd left Ashridge full time in order to spend some time work on the book. We're still working at Ashridge as well, and getting the Ordinary Joe published was something of a peak. Oh, yeah. And since then, I haven't been able to write anything else. I've tried and failed. I haven't really felt the urge to the experience of getting published. The actual experience of getting published is fantastic.
Gilbert and stick your hands in the soil for 2 years to get you.
The initial high of getting published is fantastic, but then there's quite a long, unless you really either get very lucky or are very, very good and become a bestseller and are able and get a contract to write more books, it can be quite a tough process as well. You suddenly feel quite not marginalized, that's the wrong word. You feel a bit as if there's no one there looking out for you. I don't have an agent. Most people who get published have a literary agent and then get published. I got published first and then was looking for an agent. Right. So it's quite a lonely process in some ways. And being published by one of the bigger publishers, they don't have the resources to worry about each of their individual, God knows how many authors they've got on their books. So you sort of have this brief high period, then after that it's a bit more mixed. So I then, having had dreams of becoming a best-selling author. Oh, and the book was optioned at the time to be turned into a film as well, but then that fell through. So that was another sort of series of, again, highs. You have these fantastic highs where you're having meetings with the producer and discussing it and feeling like you're really sort of a proper author and you're going to get this film made. Yeah. The very highlight of that was when I checked in with the producer. I hadn't heard from them for a while, so I checked in with them. And so any news, any developments? And he said, well, funnily enough, I was about to ring you because we've just had lunch with John Landis and talked to him about it. Now, I wouldn't have thought that my book was a John Landis type film had I been asked, but John Landis is one of my favourite directors. American Werewolf in London, particularly Blues Brothers, National Lampoon, Animal House, that sort of stuff. So it's just really exciting to hear that he passed on it, even though the net effect was the film wasn't going to get made. So then following that, rather, I've gone back into more paid work, doing sort of leadership development stuff. I was doing at Ashridge. When we last met, I was at University of the Arts London, trying to follow on from something I'd organised at Ashridge, which was an MBA, particularly for the creative industries, which we'd worked, and they'd worked really well at Ashridge, but only for one cohort. And then we lost some subsidies we'd had. The price was put up, and it became and the economic conditions got worse, and we found we couldn't fill another cohort. So I was trying to develop that at UAL, and that didn't come off. It sounds like a litany of failures so far. There have been some highlights as well.
Quite the opposite.
And so now just doing the odd bits here and there. I'm rapidly closing in on retirement age, so I describe myself as semi-retired. Yes. And trying to fill my time with other things as well.
Wow, what a story!
That was a very long answer to your first question.
No, but it's the kind of answer that we want, because I wanted people to get a sense of the breadth and expanse and variety of the roles you've played and the things you've learned along the way in that journey. And obviously I've had the privilege of sort of seeing some of that, having had our paths cross when you were at Ashridge and various elements since then. So I guess the next question is, so I'm intrigued as to what you might have brought as the artifact for the show. What have you brought with you?
It's a difficult question. All the three questions you set as homework or pre-work are incredibly straightforward and also incredibly difficult to narrow down on one answer. Sorry, Paul.
Too much to choose from.
Exactly. Yeah, you want to sort of try and narrow down on one thing, and in the end, what I've gone for is this, and I hope I can show it properly to your camera, to my camera. So Stanley Gibbons you associate with stamps.
Yes.
So this is a penny black on cover.
Wow.
From 1840.
Yes.
It the penny black. I don't know if you know much about stamps. But penny black at the bottom of it there, you can see it has two check letters.
Yes.
Which refer to the when it was printed. They were printed in sheets of, I think it's 240, and that so you start off with AA, then AB, AC, AD, all the way down to T. I think was the final letter, the final first letter, and the check letters aren't that one a JJ, and JJ is my family nickname.
Okay.
I collected stamps when I was a kid, and then, as a lot of people do, I stopped collecting stamps when you move into other things like going to the pub and chasing after women or whatever. And so the stamp collecting was put to one side. And then, as a lot of people do, I started again in middle age.
Okay.
And since my early days as a stamp collector, where I'd go along to my favourite shop in Northampton, which was run by a guy called Roy Douglas, which is stamps and models, and see what he had there. Now eBay is now the sort of main way of buying and sometimes also selling stamps. And excuse me. So the reason I chose that as an artifact, that's quite a recent acquisition. I bought that last year, and it was my dad died in September 2019, aged 98.
Wow.
An absolutely remarkable man. And we were, losing your parent is always difficult. We were quite fortunate in a way, that he'd had 98 mostly very good years, and also that had we known what was about to happen. So he died September 2019, avoiding all the horrors that affected people losing loved ones during the COVID lockdowns. And as my sister said at his funeral, he had three main wishes, which were to die at home, which he did, to have a good turnout at his funeral, which he did, and to outlive the Duke of Edinburgh, which he failed to do by about 6 months or so. But he won't have known that. So, but after he died, we had sorted out the will. I inherited a little bit of money, and not a little bit, a nice amount of money, from the sale of his house. And this is kind of tangential, but we ended up with one of my nephews bought the house. So it's a house that I lived in since I was 3 years old.
Okay.
And spent almost every Christmas there. So now that remains in the family, which is really, quite nice. We sort of spent last Christmas, or part of last Christmas there.
Great.
So I inherited a little bit of money. I thought I want to get something. My mother's dead as well. My mum died 10 years earlier. So I want to get something that sort of was a memory of both of them, really, that had some value to it, but wasn't going to break the bank. And I have got other penny blacks, but not in that sort of condition. I've got two or three sort of quite poorly kept ones. But I thought that was quite a nice thing with the JJ letters.
Yes. As
a reminder, because it was dad who gave me that nickname. Family legend isn't quite sure where it came from or why, because my middle initial isn't J.
Okay.
What we think is, I was born in May 1963. John F. Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, and they're the famous shots of his funeral where his son, John F. Kennedy Jr., is standing saluting the coffin as it goes past. And John F. Kennedy Jr. was always referred to as John John. So we think I was briefly referred to as John John, and then became JJ, and the name is stuck. And it's one of those things where it's my family nickname. It's all my mates from Northampton. I still play a bit of cricket up in Northampton. All my teammates still refer to me as JJ. But all the friends, all the people I've met between leaving Northampton around about age about 18, the last 40 years, virtually no one else calls me that.
Okay.
I've been called all sorts of things. I had all sorts of nicknames. My Astridge one was JB for John Boy rather than JJ.
Okay.
But it's just nice to have something that reminds me of Mum and Dad, that is almost not exactly the pinnacle for my stamp collecting, but is sort of a nice sort of centerpiece for it.
Yes.
The other thing I think, which is remarkable, one of the reasons, and people find stamp collecting a very odd, dull hobby, but one of the things I find fascinating about it is that you have these things that were issued in 1840. Penny blacks issued in 1840, the first ever postage stamp anywhere in the world. They're relatively rare, so typically, I won't tell you what I pay for that, 'cause it's well over the odds, because Stanley Gibbons do charge sort of 3 times what everyone else would charge. But at least you know the provenance of it, you know it's a genuine article. But you know, you could easily pick up a penny black on eBay for £50, let's say. There are stamps that were issued not long after that, say the penny red from 1858, which are literally 10 a penny now. Apart from certain plate numbers which make them more valuable, most of them, they're literally 10 a penny. And what fascinates me about that, what I like about that is these things are 170, 180 years old. They're tiny little slivers of paper, no different to modern stamps. You know, just little bits of thin paper, and yet they've survived. Not just survived in their ones and twos, but survived in their, literally in the case of the penny red or the penny lilac, in their millions. They're just loads and loads of these things lying around. They're a fascinating bit of heritage, and it's only just now, literally in the last year, so from something that started in 1840 and has been taken all around the world, it's only the last year that they've significantly changed, which is with, I don't know if you've seen some of the Christmas stamps that came out last year with barcodes on them.
Okay.
So that now they look different to how, you know, if you look at the typical Queen Elizabeth II postage stamp, just Butler framed it. It's typical Queen Elizabeth II postage stamp. It looks exactly the same. What's exactly the same as a penny black? It's the headshot of the monarch framed with the value of the stamp written on it. And that's survived 180 odd years, and now they've brought in barcodes, and they're not as good. It's changed things a little bit.
Yeah, it has, isn't it? It's sort of spoiled it. I sense as you recall the provenance of the story. I sort of, in terms of book writing and characters, you know, I've got this whole thing in my head playing out about the house and the provenance of the journey of the penny black through history and that kind of thing. You tell a very, very rich story about that. So tell me a little bit about your work at ARVON, because I know we get a lot of people who are interested in book writing, and you've described the process of writing a book as sort of perhaps more than you expected. And I know as I started down the path myself of trying to write something, I was kind of like, oh, this is a lot harder than it looks. If you think about storytelling, are you seeing more people coming through the door wanting to write stories, tell their story? Well, what's happening?
I think in one sense, yes, but in another sense, maybe not. The sense, I'm on the board of 2 charities, ARVON being one, and a charity called the School of Hard Knocks, which uses rugby and to some extent now boxing as ways of helping to train people who are out of education, training and employment, and giving them some rugby skills, but also more importantly, some sort of life skills based on the ethos of those particular sports. And in both cases, as board members, we thought that the pandemic and the lockdowns would be a killer, because they both rely on face-to-face courses for their income.
Yeah.
In the case of ARVON, that mainly comes from either sponsorship or some government programs paying School of Hard Knocks, to run courses for them. But in both cases, and particularly in the case of ARVON, they were able to shift to an online delivery, which suddenly opened up avenues that we'd never expected were there.
Oh, okay.
And ARVON's problem had always been lack of capacity. It has 3
sites,
houses.
Yeah.
There's one in Devon, one in Shropshire, and one in Yorkshire.
Yeah.
They're all in very remote locations, deliberately so that you get the whole experience. 2 of them are related. One is in one of John Osborne's old houses. One is in one of Ted Hughes' old houses. So they have that sort of literary link as well.
Okay.
But we could run maybe 30, 35 programs a year for 16 people at each one in each of those locations. And bear in mind, because it's charitable purpose, quite a big proportion of those courses had to be for schools or for disadvantaged groups or other people who weren't going to be paying into the charity coffers. So that the level of income was quite limited. We then had to keep our level of costs down to make sure we didn't lose money. And suddenly, because of the pandemic and going online. We already had some plans in hand to think about how we could do things digitally, but that all had to be accelerated because the houses had to be closed down, and it opened up incredible new markets and opportunities, which have added significantly to our revenue earning capabilities at lower cost than we had before, which is meaning we can then put more money into charitable aims of it. So it's really been, choose words carefully because it's been such a terrible time for everyone, but it has actually had some benefits to both those charities.
Yes.
The other side of the coin, though, is that obviously we lost momentum in terms of filling those face-to-face places when the houses were closed down for the best part of the year across the various lockdowns. And now, with the cost of living crisis and everything else going on at the moment, we are actually finding numbers are down for our actual face-to-face courses,
right?
Including having to have one or two of them cancelled. So it does present, there are some challenges at the moment. The nature, and I can speak to this from personal experience when I went to my course down at Totley Barton in Devon in 2007. And it goes back a bit to what we were saying about teaching online and face-to-face, and it being better when it's face-to-face. That for me, the richness of the experience was being with 15 other people who wanted to be writers and sharing stories with them, both our invented stories and our real life stories, and feeling like a writer for that week when you're down there. And I remember ever so clearly, even on the way home, a group of 6 or so of us were on the train home together from Exeter up to Paddington, and still talking about writing and sharing our ideas. And almost as soon as you got off the train, it's like kind of bang, reality hits you again, and you're back to right. I'm not a writer anymore. So I think that's one of the great things that Arvon can do is, and Arvon's not alone. There are other places as well. Arvon's the best, obviously. It's just this feeling of encouragement, of just making you feel like you're capable of doing this. I was by no means the best writer on my Arvon course. I was by no means the best writer on my Curtis Brown course. But in both cases, I was the first one to get a publishing deal. I think that's right about Arvon, maybe one person before me, which shows a little bit about, it's about writing for something that the market wants to sell. But also there's a hell of a lot of good fortune involved. I mean, you do to some extent make your own luck and have to make opportunities, but and you have to persevere, which isn't probably my greatest personal characteristic, but you have to be able to, you have to be resilient and persevere through rejection. The interesting thing is, having been published, I think one of the problems I have now trying to write more, trying to write new stories, is instead of just thinking, I'll write this and maybe I could get published, I'm now thinking, I've got to write this to a publishable level, to a publishable standard. Right. And I'm far too critical of what I produce.
Oh dear.
Now, far more critical now than I was. You said about, finding the process of writing difficult. I actually found the first bit, writing the first draft, relatively straightforward. I did that in 13 months while I was still working full-time at Ashridge in a couple of hours a night. And just the story just poured out of me and it just went down. It was really easy to do. I found revising it, especially in reaction to other people's comments, more difficult. Okay. And getting the knockbacks and having to get back on the horse and ride again, difficult.
Was that because you had to change the narrative or the characters? Tell us a little about that process, because I'm sure someone who hasn't written or been edited would be fascinated to hear about it.
It's very interesting, and I'll digress slightly and do bring me back to the point if I don't come back to it myself.
That's okay.
One of the case studies I use a lot when I talk about leadership, because I think it's one of the best run organizations, or it certainly has been one of the best run organizations in the world, is Pixar Animation, the Pixar Animation Studio. And there's a very good book written by its former president, chief executive Ed Catmull, called Creativity Inc.
Yes. And
it talks about how Pixar go about creating their fantastic films that then have more success than probably any other film production studio. And one of the things they talk about is how the importance of being able to give and receive critiques or criticism or notes, they call it in the film industry, on each other's work without getting defensive about it, but at the same time not feeling obliged that you have to take on board what other people say. And that is, there are some parallels on that with writing a book, because for the first, so I've completed the first draft in 2008. I had my first real proper professional editing comments in 2014. But for 6 years, I was getting comments from people in writing groups, and I showed finished drafts to my wife and to other friends. Including my brother. My brother and I are very close, and I showed the first draft to him, and he had the courage and the good, it was brave. It was a good enough brother to tell me he didn't like it, and I was really successful. My brother and I have quite a similar sense of humour, very similar sense of humour, very similar sort of outlook on life, and I was really surprised if he didn't like it. And dealing with that kind of feedback is quite difficult, because he's not actually making any decisions on how I should make it better. He's just basically saying, "Yeah, didn't really do it for me."
So what didn't he like?
Well, I haven't ever really gone through it with him at a detail level, but I think it could have been a consequence of bad timing. He was quite recently married when he read the draft he read, and my book is about a guy who has a married guy who has a one-night stand, and the consequences of that, and there's how he manages to keep his marriage together, basically by having to tell quite a lot of lies and make sure his wife doesn't find out. And that might have been quite challenging for Pete at that particular time in his life. I don't know, but it might also have been that the first draft was 135,000 words long. The published version is 85,000.
Okay. So
somewhere along the line there was 50,000 words that weren't actually really helping take the story through. Doesn't mean they were bad words, or some of them might have been some really good bits, but they didn't work with what ultimately became the final version. Actually, I was wrong in what I said before. I did have some professional editing before it was taken on board by Borough Press, and that again was where luck comes into it. I met a guy. I was working for Ashridge. I went to a conference and met a guy who turned out to be J.K. Rowling's agent, or part of the team that was J.K. Rowling's agent. And I told him, as one always does in those situations, that I've written a book. He said, "I'll send it in." So I sent it to him, and he was a lawyer. He worked on the legal side of things. He wasn't an editor, but he showed it to some of the people he worked with, and they liked it and called me in for a meeting. And it's interesting, so that they were suggesting some quite significant changes to characters and the narrative, whilst liking the overall flavour of it. They wanted to make some quite significant, or were suggesting some quite significant changes. And I was quite resistant to that. And the agent who I spoke to, at the end of our 1.5 hour meeting, she said, "Well, you've really fought back on it, you've really pushed back," which I really respect that, because most people come in here and they'll just do anything to get taken on board. And I was thinking, I am that person. I thought I'd do anything to get taken on. I say I like my brother. I'd quite readily sell him in order to get a deal, or give him away to get a deal. And yet, when it came to it, I was actually quite defensive and quite. I was wanted to not by in any way saying leave it alone. It's perfect as it is, but just not really wanting to make these sort of significant changes.
Yeah. And
then after Borough Press had offered me a deal, and they gave me their detailed notes on the whole script, on the whole draft, I remember sort of going through it. I went through it with my editor, and sort of as she was going through these things, I was thinking, no. And then I'd take it away and read it and think, maybe that one, maybe, all right, I'll give her that one. And by the end of it, I probably took on 95% of what she had recommended, including some quite significant changes.
Okay.
So I think when you hear from someone who knows the market, who knows how to sell things,
yes,
and knows what works and what doesn't, you really do have to pay them some attention.
Yes, sure. And how does that feed into sort of your teaching work and leadership? Because there must be some parallels, given the role that story playing plays in sort of being a leader and leadership practice. Have you noticed anything?
Well, I think that's the relevance of the Pixar example. So I think that is, in a book to some extent, it's you're on your own, you do it on your own, and then a team becomes involved later on. Whereas filmmaking, especially animated filmmaking, is far more of a team effort the whole way through.
Yeah.
But it's those key messages I take from the Pixar case study, and I do sort of augment that by talking about my own experiences to some extent as well. Mm-hmm. But the idea that as a leader, it's not your job to tell someone how to change something to make it better. It's your job to coach them through that process. I know coaching is something obviously very interested in Paul yourself. And so if my editor had said to me, change this, change this, change this, or we're not going to publish it, I probably would have done actually at that time, because the deal was in my fingers, but I'd have resented it. I wouldn't have felt happy about the relationship or how the book was going to end up looking. Whereas, because she said, it's your book, it's up to you whether you take these ideas on board or not, but this is what we would suggest you do. And then it encourages you to think about it, not just from your own perspective, but from theirs as well. And examine why am I so wedded to this thing happening or that thing happening. Going back to Pixar again, it's this idea that they have these they're called a brains trust, where every 3 months on a project they get together, talk about it, the key creatives on the project, the writer, directors, etc., bring any issues they've got to the table and they discuss it. And at the end, it's up to the key creatives on the project to decide which comments, if any, they take on board.
Yes.
And they're not obliged to take any on board. There's no hierarchy. They're not obliged to listen to John Lasseter or Ed Catmull or the people at the top of the organisation. It's entirely up to them what they take on board and what they reject. And in many cases, they'll take a lot of things on board. In a lot of cases, another idea will emerge from thinking about the ideas that have been laid out in that meeting. And they applied that. Pixar then applied that to how they operate as well. They had a couple of 2-day event where they talked about how to improve the accounting system, how to improve personnel systems or IT, whatever it might have been, all the back room stuff, and applied the same principles to that. Not as successfully, it has to be said, because there's a bit more resistance within the various teams to doing that. But what they established was there's no reason why you can't apply the same principles, whatever you might be involved in. If you're involved in building cars, whatever, there's no reason why you can't have the same principles that again, something I know you're well aware of is this whole idea of it being in VUCA times, these sort of volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous times where nobody knows the answers. So just having someone standing on a platform or a plinth saying, do this, do that, this is how we're going to solve this problem, increasingly doesn't work. You need the sort of to crowdsource to get the what's the word, not groupthink, the opposite groupthink, the sort of get as many ideas as possible together and then sift through them and have processes for making, and then deciding what action you're going to take. So I think there is something in that in the process of getting a book published, but it's exemplified even better in the Pixar example.
Yeah, no, I love that. I must admit, I love the Pixar story. It's a great book for anyone who hasn't had a chance to read it. And I love the fact that you're actually taking that into the classroom and using it as an exemplar for participants in the courses. So, we've talked about it a book at times, and certainly, the last 2.5 years have been that for sure. I think it's always been the case, but it certainly got amplified during the pandemic. And I wondered if there was anything that you'd particularly, given your political activism, anything you changed your mind on, and if so, what was it, and what made you change your mind?
There is. It's quite embarrassing actually. Okay. Sitting here, but there's a thermometer or a temperature gauge underneath my video screen, which is now just ticked up to 36 degrees. And the thing I changed my mind about is climate change.
Right.
To the extent I was never a Piers Corbyn or Nigel Lawson. I was never a climate change denier, but I had quite significant doubts about the amount to which it was our problem. It was man created. And having no background in science, and particularly not in sort of how the solar system works at all, I had got it into my head that it was more to do with the operation that you had a sun, sun, not flashes, what are they called?
The solar storms.
Solar storms. Where the heat from the sun just basically increases periodically
on the surface of the sun.
Yeah, and I think I managed to convince myself that that was the major part of this, and that whatever man had been doing for the last 150 years was having was of less importance.
Right.
And tracing, and because you can find, you don't have to be Piers Corbyn to find the evidence you want to back that up. You can look at the fact that we had, talk about 1976, the fact we had severe heat wave 46 years ago surely means that nothing's changed between now and then. Well, of course, I now realise everything has changed, or a lot of things have changed. In fact, I saw on Twitter just before we came on air that none of the 10 hottest days in the UK were in 1976. No. They've all been in the 21st century. And I don't think there's a particular thing that changed my mind on that. I think it's far more, what prevented me changing my mind was this cognitive dissonance that you go through, where you just refuse to believe the evidence that contradicts your firmly held view.
Right.
And can all, and just, especially if it comes from a source you don't particularly have in particular time for or give particular credence to. And so I think it's just a build-up over many years. So I haven't had that view for probably at least the last 10 years. It was but it probably took about 10 years for me to change from believing that man wasn't to blame to accepting that we are. And so it wasn't a blinding flash of light. It was more just allowing the barriers to drop, so that more and more of the evidence proving me wrong was sort of, I was able to assimilate more and more of it.
Good, and I assume that sort of has now filtered into habits and the ways where you do stuff, both in your personal and your professional life, moving forward as best as we can.
Well, no, the reason I laugh about it is that the thing that has prompted me to look very seriously at how I use energy has been the price hikes for the last 6 months. Yes. I'm ashamed to say. I don't think much about the planet dying led me to that.
You need pain to make you move, don't you? So
yeah.
Yes, I was thinking this morning about how we can restore British manufacturing. I thought, well, if we all sort of hunkered down and made wind turbines that could sit in gardens and feed the house. There are sort of off-grid places that do that, but the cost of the turbines is surprisingly considerable. Whereas if we could do it in a way that made sense and cheaper, and found different ways of doing pricing that made it affordable, you could actually say, well, every home should have one if it were possible.
Yeah.
Obviously, there are flats and apartments and various living situations that don't allow that, but
I think with the economic pressures as well now really mounting, we're almost we probably perhaps are in a 1930s situation where, particularly in America, to get out of the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt just spent billions and billions of dollars on projects to keep people in work. Yeah, it's funny seeing the Rishi Sunak being accused of socialism recently, but that was, by American standards, the closest ever been to what might be defined or described as a socialist approach, just pouring money in to keep people in work, as a result of which they got these incredible infrastructure developments. And that's possibly an area we and the rest of Europe, rest of the developed world need to look more and more at, is just how do we spend money wisely. Grant Shapps on telly this morning saying that sorting out the transport infrastructure will take decades to make it fit for a 40-degree centigrade climate. Will take decades, which is, actually I think quite an honest thing for him to say. But we haven't done anything about it for the last decades. Certainly
that's why it's going to take so long.
Yeah, had we started doing it, had we started doing it when people like me were sceptical, we'd be in a lot better position now.
We would. I think it's fascinating. I think also it's interesting that, we could wait 40 years, or we could just stop travelling if that was. And I know that's not practical for everyone, but
another, and this hasn't been a conscious thing, just a byproduct of COVID. I haven't been out of the country since before the first lockdown.
Right.
So good 2.5 years. I typically have been taking 3 or 4 plane journeys a year, and I'm in no great rush to get back on a plane. Not least just because of the complete chaos at airports at the moment. But
yes,
I think that is a change I could make to my life quite easily, is to not bother going abroad anymore.
Yes, I'm with you there. I managed to go to Switzerland a couple of times, and that was enough. So there better be a good reason, to really get me out. It's interesting, and part of the climate reality project that Al Gore set up. So with COP27 around the corner, it'll be interesting to see if we finally move into implementation, or whether we just decide that we're going to talk about it a bit more because it's a bit too hard.
I think it's getting to the point where today is a perfect example of that, isn't it? That we're getting to a point where we just can't push it to one side anymore.
No,
and it's very depressing to see that the leadership candidates in the Tory leadership race are doing just that. None of them are. To start thinking about this stuff and talking about it in terms of wokeness is just ridiculous, as we're literally burning, we're frying.
Yes, we need to be awake, not woke. There's a big difference. So I'm wondering, I asked you to have a think about your favourite story, and this is always my favourite part of the show, because people come up with stories and you go, oh, that's awesome. So what did you come up with? What's your favourite? I'm sure you've many, but what did you pick for us today?
I'm still slightly conflicted or between two options. Whether it'd be better to tell a personal story.
We can tell them both if you want.
Or both. Well, they're very, very different.
Okay.
So if again, it goes back in a way to the leadership stuff that I do.
Okay.
So I'll tell the historic, inspirational one, and then we'll see if we've got time for a more inconsequential one. One of my favourite leadership stories is the Ernest Shackleton story.
Right.
Of how his exhibition went wrong, but he managed to save the lives of everyone who was with him. So, but I imagine, but rather than do that one, a similar story, which I find incredibly impressive, is the story of the Uruguayan rugby team who crashed in the Andes.
Okay.
And I'm possibly not across the detail quite as much as I would with the Shackleton one, but I think it's an interesting story to talk about, which is, so it was, I think it was, no, I'm sure the year, I think it was 1976.
Okay.
Which is charming, something we've just been talking about. Sorry, 1972.
Okay.
And there were 19 rugby players en route from Uruguay to Chile to play a rugby match in Chile. And they had some supporters, friends, family with them as well. And there were 5 crew on the plane, 45 people in total on a fairly small Uruguayan Air Force aircraft. And it crashed into a very remote spot in the Andes. And the story was captured in a book by the journalist Pierre Paul Reed called Alive, which then became a quite well-known film.
Okay.
And one of the things that the incident is most remembered for, and most people, if you say, have you seen Alive? Do you know about the Uruguayan rugby team that crashed in the Andes? The thing most people associate with is the fact that in order to stay alive, the survivors of the crash ended up having to eat their dead teammates, relatives, the crew of the plane. Those who hadn't survived. Mm-hmm. When they ran out of their very meager food supplies, it was only a 3 or 4 hour plane journey that they'd planned for. When they ran out of their very meager food supplies, they literally looked for every alternative just to keep themselves alive. Anything they ate, they tried to eat their belts because anything that was organic, anything like the leather of the belt, the seats on the plane were stuffed with cotton, some sort of cotton stuff. They tried to eat the cotton, and it just made them sicker. And after several days of near starvation, they just came to the conclusion that they were going to have to use the only protein source that was available, which is the bodies of the dead people.
Oh dear.
And I think, again, so I just got the numbers right, but I think in the initial impact, 12 people were killed. The tail broke off the plane, and 3 or 4 people were killed in the tail, and then in total 12 were killed initially. So 33 survived. Then several died of their injuries over the next few days. But then after a couple of weeks, when they were trying to deal with the problems they had, they knew by this stage that the search party had been called off, that there was no way of spotting a white plane in snow in the top of the Andes. So there's no one looking for them. And they were trying to work out what to do, and they decided they were going to have to try and get out from where they were and see if they could find help themselves. And at that point, there's an avalanche which came down and filled the plane that they were sleeping in, the part of the fuselage they were still sleeping in, and killed another dozen or so people. So in the end, the total, in the end, 29 of the 45 people died.
Right.
So then they were stuck. The captain of the rugby team had been the leader, had died in the avalanche. So a guy called Nando Paratho took over, and he wrote a book a few years back called Miracle in the Andes, which describes it, I think, better than the initial Live did, because it's sort of more personal. And he and one other guy set out to walk across the Andes, or to climb up and down the Andes to get into Chile to try and find help. They had no climbing gear. They had to use their rugby boots and 3 or 4 pairs of trousers to keep out the cold, but then it could also get very hot when the summer's shining. And no climbing experience, but they just knew that if they didn't make it and find help, everyone on that mountain was going to die. And it took them 10 or 11 days to climb across the Andes down into Chile. A distance of it was only about 35 or 40 miles. They weren't walking great long distances each day, but it's just such difficult terrain.
Yes. And
various incidents where one or both of them could have quite easily been killed. And they got onto the foothills, into the plateau beneath the Andes or beyond the Andes, and bumped into found a Chilean farmer and announced who they were. And it was reminiscent of when Shackleton arrived on in Port Stanley. In Port Stanley? Yeah, after his great journey, he arrived there and saw a Norwegian, and everyone assumed that Shackleton was dead, so the Norwegian was really surprised to see him. And similarly, this guy, they turned up and they announced who they are. At least they could speak the same language.
Yes.
But they announced who they were, and then they could mount a rescue and get the rest of the people down. So 16 of them eventually survived. But there's a quote from Paratho's book which really resonates with me, which is, he talks about how as they were making their journey across the Andes, facing death at every step and not really expecting to achieve their goal. They didn't really expect they were going to be able to get to the other side. They just felt like they had to be doing something. And he says something like, death has an opposite, but the opposite of death isn't life or living. The opposite of death is love. And that every step they took, he kept saying, every step I took was a step nearer to being with my father, to see my father again. And it was that love that kept him going. It wasn't just a need to stay alive for himself. His mum and sister had been on the plane and both died.
Right.
So he felt he had to get to home. He had to be able to tell his dad what had happened.
Motivator.
Yeah, and how his mum had died initially in the crash. His sister had survived a few days, so he wanted to be able to tell his father what happened, and he knew that if he didn't make it, his father would never know. And it was that thing kind of kept him going. So I think that's just I love stories like that. It's linked to Shackleton. It's like the Chilean miners, the 33 miners who were trapped in the Chilean tin mine for all those days, and you do get these. From a leadership perspective, from a human perspective, they're amazing. But from a leadership perspective, you just find out these things about why is it that one person can do what Nando Paratho did and someone else couldn't. Yeah. And I'd like to say, we all hope we'll be the person. So Nando Paratho was in a coma, was unconscious for 3 days after the crash.
Goodness.
And it's like, although they had the captain of the rugby team was still alive and he was sort of the leader, it's like they all felt they needed, and he had a smashed-in skull, but they all felt they needed Paratho to help lead them. And so I'd like to think I'd be that person. I'd be the one who'd be the leader. I wouldn't. I'd be cowering and shaking and crying in a corner. So, but you need to know who those people are who are going to lead you out of that situation.
I think many of us would, John. It's what a story that is. I shall have to go and dig that out now and read.
It's a really beautiful book, the Miracle in the Andes.
Miracle in the Andes. Okay, I will go and look for that. Well, we've almost come to the end of our time, John, so it's been a joy to talk to you. Where would you like people to go and find out more about you and connect with you? What's the best way to do that?
It's probably Twitter these days, but then you do have to put up with a a lot of vitriol. My Twitter stuff tends to be either politics, sport, mainly cricket and rugby, and a bit of sort of film and media. But that's where I'm most active, I suppose, at the moment. I don't do a lot of.
And what's your
I don't blog or anything like that.
For Twitter?
At Jon Jon 234.
Jon
all spelled out in words.
Yeah,
at Jon 234.
All right, cool. That's great. Well, I encourage you, knowing you as I do, and lucky to have known you for some time. It's always great to sort of keep track, certainly of your Twitter stuff. And this has been an absolute pleasure, Jon. It's lovely to listen to your story about the artifact, and just how you've progressed since we last met. So thank you so much.
I suppose if I have one message, I've mentioned before, I've got two boys, two sons who are now 20 and 18. I suppose one thing I've learned, which I want to ensure that they know about as well, and pass on to them as best I can when they get to know, start listening to me again. None of it's planned. My plan, when I joined the service age 21, my dad's reaction was, that's great, you get a great pension when you retire. And you kind of think, yeah, that's good, yeah. But then now I'm close to getting that pension, I'm actually quite glad I got it. But for Dad, that's my idea. He's more of a small businessman. The idea of this solid income, which would even go on after you retire, was really important to him. I'm the opposite. I just think nothing is planned. You find opportunities where they lie. Some of it you can actively go out and try and create those opportunities. I haven't done a huge amount of that myself. The successes I've had have been down to much hard work and good fortune, but also, and nothing importantly to me, one can control is just being a decent person, so people want you on their team, not on their team. I asked you before we went on live whether swearing was allowed, and I'll have to warn you, I'll just quickly in closing. She's work I do at University of Surrey with my professor Andy Adcroft, who'd actually be good to get on this as well sometime. We have an idea, his idea first actually, an idea for a programme. Basically all our programmes are a variation on this theme, and that is, we'd like to have a programme which is called Don't Be a Dick. Whatever you're doing in life, don't be a dick, and you'll get on better for it by being a decent person.
Yeah.
You're not going to lie your way to being Prime Minister, but ultimately someone's going to judge you.
Jon, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Well, that was fabulous interview with Jon Teckman. Paul did really well there. Sign of a good interview doesn't say very much. It's excellent. So I loved that. I thought the standout thing in his story, I think, was really his honesty. He described his failure as a writer. He used the word luck a few times, but I think he ended that with "Don't be a dick." Not always successful at doing that myself, but I try my best. So, well, thank you very much for tuning in to Artefact Live once again. This is our 74th show, so we're rapidly getting towards 100. We're nearly there. I've been talking to a few people about joining the show as guests, some fascinating folk coming on. So I can't wait to get people on again and talk to them about their lives and their thoughts like Jon just did. But if you have any questions, please drop me a line. I've got a new email. It's scott@artefactlive.com. I thought it was about time I started to use the artifact thing a bit more. So scott@artefactlive.com. Any suggestions for guests, or if you'd like to come on yourself, why not? Drop us a line and we'll have a chat about it. I'm always delighted to hear from anybody. It was a bit like what Paul just said there about one of our best guests was a chap who happens to be a forklift truck driver, but he's written all these books. It's amazing. So yeah, everyone's welcome on here. It's part of the ethic of the show and why Paul and I are delighted to continue Artefact Live together. So thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you next week. I'll do my little summary video as usual. But as I always say, I think stories are important, and I genuinely believe that a good story can act as an empathy engine. And boy, do we need more empathy. It's just something that we need everywhere, more now than I think probably than any other part of my life, and maybe even more than any other part of human history. So let's keep telling stories, and keep your eyes open and your ears open, because today's the day that you might find a story that could change the world. So thank you very much for tuning in to Artefact Live. My name's Scott MacArthur. His name's Paul Crick. He's just disappeared to do something, and we'll see you next week. Thank you for tuning in.